welcome back to Indie Rebel, the podcast for independent filmmakers. My name's Christopher Tempel, and we're going to jump right into it today. Today is all about script writing. Last week, we talked about story development. This week, we're going to talk about the actual process of writing a movie script. We're going to cover the basics of how a script is set up. We're going to talk about software. We're going to talk about how to deal with writer's block. I'll give you a couple little tips I know of on how to get natural sounding dialogue. And so just some other things to be aware of when you're putting together a short or feature-length movie script. Now, full disclosure, I am not a writer. I'm a filmmaker first, and I choose to write my own stuff second. So everything I tell you today is coming about it from the filmmaker's perspective rather than a writer's perspective. I do say, written and directed by Christopher Tempel, but I don't consider myself a writer. I am first and foremost a filmmaker. And so there's going to be some things where if you are more into the writing process, you will listen to that and be like, what is he talking about? That doesn't make any sense. It's because I'm coming to it from the filmmaker's point of view. So let's start with some basics here. First off, the most important thing you need to know about a properly formatted movie script is that 1 page of script roughly equals 1 minute of screen time. That is the mathematical formula. So if you have a 90-page script and it's properly formatted, you should have a 90-minute movie when all is said and done. Now, there's always going to be exceptions to this. If you've got a script that's extremely dialogue heavy, like something like Clerks, your page per minute might be off because dialogue tends to go a lot faster than what it's actually written at. And then on the inverse of that, if you have a very action-heavy script, there's a chance that the final film will be longer than what your script is. And that's because you can have a paragraph of action that takes up, 3/8 of a page. And that 3/8 of a page ends up being sometimes even 10 minutes of movie, depending on how lazy the writer is. There's an old story that, back in the days of Westerns, screenwriters would get lazy and they didn't want to write all the little details of the big action scene at the end of the movie. And so they would just write, "The Indians take the fort." They didn't tell you how they take the fort. That was up to the director to figure out. They would just write, "The Indians take the fort." George Lucas did that famously in the Star Wars prequels. The first draft he turned into the effects department so they could get started on developing looks for the creatures and the planets and stuff. He jokingly said, yeah, there's a lot of just "they fight" in here, talking about the Jedi Knights having lightsaber battles and that sort of thing. He didn't go through and script it out exactly. Now, as an independent filmmaker, you get to make that choice yourself when you are writing your script. You can do it as simple as "they fight," and you figure that out later on set. You could get very detailed and do a blow-for-blow description of what you're seeing. Maybe if you've got a background in martial arts or such, then you're able to be that descriptive. What I like doing when it comes to something like that is I just like to meet it somewhere in the middle. I might talk about, the bad guy throws a punch, the other guy ducks out of the way, and the fight continues. So you kind of get the idea as you're reading it, what you're seeing, without it being overly descriptive. We'll talk about being overly descriptive in a little bit too. Another example of why sometimes the page per minute doesn't work is if your script is just not formatted properly at all. Robert Rodriguez, when he wrote El Mariachi back in the early 90s, he wrote it on a word processor. I think it was an early version of Microsoft Word that he had access to at his job as a clerk at the college. And so he didn't have any proper formatting for it. He basically wrote the movie like a stage play. And his final script came out to be something like 35 or 40 pages. And yet the movie itself is, 85 minutes long. And he knew every time he would close his eyes and picture a movie screen and watch his movie, he knew it was going to be about an 80 to 90-minute movie, but his script was completely formatted the wrong way. It was definitely formatted much more like a stage play, and so his page per minute count was off. Later, we're going to talk about, too, why this equation is so important. You're going to find that I'm very focused on page counts, but not in the way that a writer would be. I'm focused on it from the filmmaker's perspective, and we'll talk about why in just a little bit. Okay, so if you want to have a properly formatted script, there's a couple ways you can go about it. You can go the old school approach like Hollywood did for over 100 years when they were using typewriters for everything. And that's to actually know what your margins need to be, know what your indentations need to be with tab and such. And you can do it brute force like that. But that's a bit of a pain in the butt. Instead, today we have something called script software, and script software makes this process a lot easier. It handles the formatting for you. The catch is that you do have to know what kind of element you're trying to type or wanting to type, and you're going to access those elements usually with a hotkey consisting of either enter or tab. And different softwares will use different combinations of enter and tab to make it work. But the good news is that once you've selected the element you want to be typing, it's already positioned perfectly on the page. Now, having this proper formatting, aside from our equation we talked about earlier, this will also let you quickly identify elements in your script like scenes and dialogue bits and even action headings and such. And this all comes into play later on when we're trying to actually break down a script and put the movie together. Now, when it comes to screenwriting software, you do have a couple different options. If you're really, really old school and you don't want to use like the latest and greatest stuff, there are macros and templates you can get for Microsoft Word or Google Docs. So you can use the same word processing program that you're already using, and that will work for you just fine. I actually wrote my first feature and all my shorts before that using a macro for Microsoft Word called Drama Dog. I don't think it's around anymore. I have tried looking for it just to see if it's even around. I can't even find any mentions of it anywhere online. It's almost like the Mandela effect. It's super crazy. But what it would let you do is it would add an additional icon bar at the top of your Word document where you could select scene heading, action, character, dialogue, parenthetical, transition. I think there was even one for shot or something like that. And then the other thing it would do is it would also allow me to use Alt A for action, Alt S for scene. So Alt became kind of your hotkey to select which option you wanted if you didn't want to click on your header all the time. And it actually worked out pretty well. And when I clicked and selected which element I wanted, it was already now lined up on the page exactly where it needed to be. Now, you also had to go ahead and set up your font, right? You need to make sure you use some sort of Courier font, which is like typewriters and such. But it does work. And I do know that there are templates and macros out there for Google Docs and Microsoft Word even till this day, but they're not commonly used in the industry. Instead, we find ourselves with two options, and that's with either online web apps or standalone applications. An online web app is nice because you can log on from any computer anywhere in the world that has internet access, and you can pull your script right up because everything's there in the cloud, right? The drawback to it is if you're somebody like me that lives in the middle of nowhere where internet can be sketchy and you have DSL like I do, then maybe an fully connected online script service is not the best way to go. I like having offline access. Having offline access also means that I can go right in a public park somewhere and not have to tether my laptop to my phone. It also means that I can, if I really want to, climb to the top of a mountain and write my script up there. I remember in my early days, I would even go to the food court at the mall in the town I was living in, and I would just sit there for a couple hours, and that was like my quote unquote coffee shop, which is famously used for Hollywood screenwriters to write their movies. So I like the standalones, but really use whatever works best for you. And the key to doing that is going to be to try them all out. Try some different online services. There's some free ones, there's some paid ones. The paid ones are usually going to be better than the free ones. Same with the offline software, the standalone applications. There's going to be free ones, there's going to be paid ones. And most of the time, the paid ones are going to be better or offer you more features. And we're going to kind of break down all those different applications right now, and I'm going to cover kind of some of the pros and cons from my point of view. It's going to sound like I'm very biased towards Final Draft. One, because I paid for it, and so I obviously like using that because I did feel like it was the best option for me. But really, all that matters is that at the end of the day, you get your script on the page and get your all that stuff that's jumbling around your head onto the paper so that way you can communicate your idea to your cast and crew. So let's start talking about the different software options that are out there. First up, we have our free category. And in the free category, the top contenders that I can find are going to be Kit Scenarist, that's KIT, and another one called Writer Solo. Now, Writer Solo is both an online application or you can download it as a standalone application. And I actually did just check into that yesterday as I was preparing for this podcast to make sure that I had my facts straight on it. So you literally just go into your writersolo.com, get into your account, and you'll click your account button at the bottom left of the screen, and there'll be an option to download an offline version of the program. Kit Scenarist. That is an open source screenwriting program written by a dude in Russia. I don't think he's actively developing it anymore. I think he's moved on to a different application that's more story centric, but it is still available. It still runs. And the best part about both of these options, either Writer Solo or Kit, is that they are available on Windows, Mac, and Linux, and they are totally free, which is like really cool, especially if you're somebody like me who used to be like Linux heavy for all your pre-production stuff. Having access to good screenwriting software is just awesome. So know that both Kit and Writer Solo are available Windows, Mac, and Linux, and they are free. Now, I think Kit has the better story development tools. It's got its own version of a beat board in there. It's got different tabs and pages for like a synopsis and character breakdowns and all that kind of stuff. So if you remember last week when we were talking about the importance of a beat board and mapping out your story, I think Kit is the better option for that. However, I think that Writer Solo has got a much cleaner, easier to use user interface. And if I was writing a script and I was using one of those two, I would probably prefer to write with Writer Solo and do my development in Kit. And so I would use both of them side by side, kind of like I talked about using Freeform to do. If you're on a Mac, you can use Freeform to plan your movie that way too. Kit has a lot of those same features built right into it. So definitely give them both a download and a look and see what works best for you. Now, the drawback to them is that there's not going to be a lot of bells and whistles because they are free. If you're wanting collaboration with other writers, then you're going to need to upgrade to what we call the cheaper options. For that, number one that I hear about a lot is Writer Duet, which is kind of the paid online version of Writer Solo. So if you already are using Writer Solo and you like it, Writer Duet will now allow for collaboration with other screenwriters. So if you've got a writing partner and they live in another city, you guys can work on the same scripts together, which is kind of nice. Celtics is another option. Celtx. Celtics is an interesting beast. I think they still let you write a basic script for free, but they really want you to get into their paid online system. It used to be a standalone application, but now it is purely online. It's online only. What I do like about Celtics and what I liked about the old standalone version from back in the day is that they have a lot of other pre-production features. I was able to break down my script. I could tag elements and print, breakdown sheets. You can do your scheduling in it too. In fact, I actually prefer the scheduling in Celtics to most other softwares that are out there aside from Movie Magic. Movie Magic is definitely my favorite, and we'll talk about that in a couple weeks when we talk about scheduling your movie. But when it comes to just overall features, Celtics has a lot going for it, but it's not really used a whole lot anymore, and I'm not sure why that is. I think people have just kind of moved on to other things, and when you've got a free software that transitions to an online subscription program, you're going to lose a lot of your audience doing that, and I think that's probably what happened with them. I also want to add there is some other software that falls into this level of, kind of the affordable subscription based stuff. I just don't have a lot of experience with them. And so I can't really comment on them. So if you're somebody that uses a different app and you're like, hey, he didn't talk about the one that I use, it's because I've probably haven't touched it, okay? I've used a lot of the stuff that's out there, but I haven't used it all. And I'm not going to give opinions on something that I don't know anything about. So if you're using something else and it does work for you, great. I'm just trying to give people that are new to this an overview of the tools that I'm aware of and the tools that I've personally used. And I have used Celtics back in the day too. I do want to throw that out there. I did use Celtics when it was a standalone because it was available on Linux, and at the time I was very Linux heavy. So now we move up to the pro category of screenwriting software. And this is where you're going to find your industry standards. And there's really only two of them now that are commonly used. The first one is called Faden. I believe it currently costs $80. Don't quote me on that. You'd have to go look it up. But it is called Faden. Faden is available on Windows, Mac, and Linux. So that's great. If you're a Linux user, you can actually have professional writing software and not use some of the freer options. And Faden is slowly being adopted by some members of the industry. Most famously, Rian Johnson, the director of some of the Star Wars movies and Knives Out, that whole series. He uses Faden. I have a copy of Faden. I bought it probably over a decade ago for about 50 bucks at the time. And I, at one point, had some issues. I emailed the developer, and within probably an hour, he got back to me and we were able to resolve my issue. So even the support from the developer is top notch when it comes to Faden. The downside to Faden is it lacks all the other story development tools that I like within Final Draft, like the beat boards and things like that. So speaking of Final Draft, that is of course the other white elephant in the room. It is the industry standard. And when people say industry standard, what they really mean is it's the one used most often in the industry. Part of that is because of the legacy. Final Draft has been around since the early 90s. Part of it too is, now the studios have developed a workflow around it and around the files that Final Draft can export. Now, a lot of these other apps like Faden can export the Final Draft file formats, and so it is easy to interchange, but at the end of the day, it really is easier if you're on a big project or a show and everyone else is using Final Draft. It's easier just to get a copy of Final Draft and go with it. Now, Final Draft retails for about $250. You can routinely find it on sale for as low, I think I've seen it for like $170. Now, the one drawback to it is that while it is a purchase it and you own it forever, you only own that version forever. So with Faden, you buy it once, you get free upgrades as they update the software. With Final Draft, if right now I've got Final Draft 13, if 14 comes out and I want to upgrade to 14, I have to pay an upgrade fee to get 14. And usually it's like $100 or something like that. Not horrible, but it is something to be aware of. That said, my current version of Final Draft 13 does everything I could want it to do. Like, I can't even imagine what else they would add in version 14 to make me want to switch. So I'm quite happy keeping version 13 for years to come. I don't feel the need to upgrade out of that. So as you can tell, I'm definitely kind of a shill when it comes to Final Draft. I love it. Part of it is because I paid for it, and I feel like when you invest in software, you're more apt to want to continue using it because you paid good money for it. With the free software, and when I was using free or cheaper software, I was more apt to switch around and try to find what was working best for me because I wasn't financially invested in it. So it's no secret that Final Draft is the gold standard by which I compare all these other ones to. And at the end of the day, if I were to recommend a free option for somebody that would get me as close to Final Draft as possible, I would probably recommend Writer Solo. And the reason has to do with that page count. Remember at the beginning, the first thing I mentioned is that a properly formatted screenplay has one page equaling 1 minute of final screen time. And what I have found over the years is that this page count is not equal in all applications. And that's because everybody has their own standard of what those margins should be, and they're all using different fonts as well. Final Draft comes with its own font. You can't get it anywhere else. It's called Courier Final Draft, and it's designed to perfectly mimic a typewriter, and it's designed so that the width of the characters and the margins that Final Draft sets up, like that has just become the gold standard here. With something like Celtics, oh man, Celtics was horrible. I wrote a feature in Celtics and I brought it into Final Draft. This is probably 15 years ago, just for the fun of it to play with Final Draft, and I had a demo version of it. And my page count was off by something like 10 or 15 pages when all was said and done. And it was not like it was 10 or 15 pages like longer in Final Draft. It was 10 or 15 pages shorter in Final Draft. And the reason why I really focus on this page count thing is because for me as an indie filmmaker with a background in short films, I really struggled when I started writing features. So much so that I was like, I knew in my head, okay, a feature film is anything considered longer than like 70 minutes. I need to hit that 70-page mark. I need to hit that 70-minute mark. And what I found is when I brought my script from Celtics into Final Draft, that my 70-page Celtic script suddenly became a 60-page Final Draft script. And I was like, no. And since I know that this 1 page per minute rule is kind of based on Final Draft now, like that's considered to be the most accurate version, suddenly I had a movie that was going to be too short and I had to really workshop it to make the thing longer. So when it comes down to it, I think Writer Solo, and probably Writer Duet, I've never messed with Writer Duet, but Writer Solo has been the most accurate to Final Draft. Fading comes close, but Writer Solo, I took a 90-page script from Final Draft, I brought it into Writer Solo, I was off by half a page. Like, that's not bad at all. I think Fade In, I'm off by maybe a page and a half. So it's not horrible. And it's, for most independent filmmakers, it's good enough. And if you've got an 80 or 90-page script, you're going to be just fine. But if you're sitting at, 70 pages and you're like, I really want to make this thing a feature, and you've got a lot of dialogue, there's a good chance that you're going to come in way under. I actually saw an example of this, so weird tangent here, from the TV show Rebel Without a Crew. And it was where Robert Rodriguez picked like 5 aspiring filmmakers who had never made a feature before, and he gave them each $7,000 to kind of re-replicate what he did on El Mariachi. And it's really interesting. Highly recommend checking it out if you get a chance. And one of the contestants, his script, I don't know how long it was, but his quote unquote feature called Monday ended up only being something like 55 minutes long when all was said and done. And that tells me he was either using a different program where the page count was totally jacked up, or he just didn't have his script properly formatted. And given that the criteria to getting into the show was to have a formatted script, I'm assuming that it was just the software he was using and the count ended up being completely off. So he probably had what he thought was going to be able to stretch out to, a 70-minute movie, and he ended up with like a 55 or 60-minute movie. So that's kind of why I obsess about this stuff a little bit. And it kind of made me like a little gun shy about this too. Like, I got very paranoid about now using anything other than Fade In or Final Draft because I wasn't able to hit my numbers. Okay, enough rambling about all that kind of stuff. Let's carry on here. One thing that I do like and appreciate about most of the screenwriting software that's out there is that they all make use of some form and combination of enter and tab to navigate between your elements. And while it may be a little bit different between program to program, it's close enough that generally speaking, when you've learned one screenwriting program, you can master another in just a matter of minutes. It's like driving somebody else's car where, yeah, okay, the buttons might be in a different position, but you know what you're looking for and you've got a general gist of where they should be, and it's just going to work itself out. So what I mean by enter and tab, if I want to switch lines on my script, like let's say I'm writing an action line, we'll talk about these different elements in a second, but let's say I'm writing action, I press enter, and it wants to start writing another line of action, a new paragraph of action. But if I press tab, it now jumps over and lets me type in a character. So now I type the character's name. I want to type what the character is going to say. I press enter, and Final Draft automatically gets me into dialogue, which is great. So now I'm typing what the character is supposed to say. Now, this is where the differences will be in some programs. In a lot of programs, if I press enter, it defaults back to action, and I have to press tab again to go into the next character. Final Draft and Fade In 2 also allow you to continue conversations easily. So instead of jumping over to another action line, after a character is done talking, I press enter, it jumps down to a new character line. I start typing that character's name. If it's already in the system, it propagates. If not, I just type the whole thing. I press enter again, and I'm back down into dialogue mode. So now I'm ready to start typing action again. All I got to do is when I get done with that character's dialogue, I press enter twice. Boop, boop, and now I'm back to action mode. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about this combination of enter and tab to navigate your interface. And once you learn it, you're able to just fly through a script super quick, and you don't even have to think about it anymore. It really does become second nature. All right, so let's get into the nitty gritty. I've wasted 20 minutes here talking about software. Let's get into actually the writing process, okay? Before you start, I'd recommend a couple of things. One, read a bunch of screenplays. You can find them anywhere on the internet these days. Get a good PDF file. Sometimes it'll be one where somebody typed up themselves. A lot of times you can actually find photo scans that are saved as a PDF of your favorite movie scripts. And don't just read like your favorite movies, but find scripts that are in the genre of the movie you're wanting to make. When I was writing Leap Rise of the Beast, I knew I wanted it to kind of feel like a love letter to the Bourne franchise. So I downloaded The Bourne Identity, The Bourne Supremacy, The Bourne Ultimatum, and I studied those scripts. I said, how does the writer handle his scene breaks? How does he handle dialogue? What does the dialogue look like? What does action look like? I knew the movie so well. I'd watch them almost every day. So I could now read the script and see how that translated to the screen, and it gave me a good basis to pull from. And I was able to tweak the style of my writing to more closely match what I was trying to emulate with my script. So go online, and I just do a Google search for, let's say I wanted one for Casino Royale. I type in Casino Royale screenplay PDF download, and you'll find a bunch of sites that'll take you to something like that. Some of them you have to read online. The ones I prefer are the ones you can actually download, because then I can print them and actually read it like a real movie script then. So that's a lot of fun to do. And I just find it helps my process. I don't like reading things off of a screen very much. Now, when it comes to printing your scripts, I cannot recommend enough getting a cheap laser printer off of Amazon. I've got an HP, it's wireless. I think I spent 90 bucks on it. The toner lasts forever, but the best part is that it prints out your pages super, super quick. I used to only have an inkjet printer, okay, like from my high school days, and that's what I had to use for everything. It is so painfully slow to print a movie script on an inkjet printer. Now, if that's all you have and you don't have a lot of money, by all means use it. But if you can afford to, I would highly recommend investing in a LaserJet printer. It took 30 minutes to print a script on an inkjet. It takes less than 5 on my laser. Like, it's just done. I can usually hit print, go to the bathroom, I come back, and I've got a final script waiting for me. Like, it just doesn't get any better than that. The other thing you'll want to do is you'll want to get some pre-punched paper. Sure, you can save some money and go through and punch it all yourself, but really, like, let's be honest, it's just faster and easier if you just buy the pre-punched paper to begin with. In fact, that's all I buy now. And my wife hates it. She likes regular paper without the holes. And so we're constantly like fighting over the printer. Sometimes it seems like I've got my 3-hole punch in, and then she'll stack in a couple layers of non-punched paper and then forget to take it out. And then I go to print something and there's no holes, or vice versa, where I've put 3-hole paper on top of hers. And now she's got stuff coming out with 3 holes. But yeah, I like the 3-hole punch paper just because it's what I use all the time. It's nice. The other thing you're going to want is some brads, some brass brads. That almost sounds like a tongue twister. Some brass brads. You need to make sure you get the big ones so your paper's not going to slip through the brads themselves on the holes. And when you bind your script, you only want to bind the top hole and the bottom hole. Okay, you do not do the middle. And I think it has something to do with the efficiency of, if somebody was trying to duplicate scripts back in the 90s, it was a lot easier to just do your top and bottom, undo those, make your photocopies, and rebind it back together. But I find it's actually easier too to like hold the script and flip through the script that way when you don't have that center brad. So you just put one on the top, one on the bottom. You can also get a notebook. I do that all the time. I usually buy one of those white ones with the clear cover on them for every movie that I do, and then I'll put my title page in the cover, and then on the back side, I put my shooting schedule. So whenever we want to know what scenes we're shooting next, I just flip my script binder over, and it's right there ready to go. So little pro tips for you guys. All right, moving on, let's talk about elements. Elements are the fundamentals of a screenplay within the screenplay software. And it's just those different things that I was talking about earlier. So you've got scene headings, you've got action, characters, dialogue, parentheticals, and transitions. There are some other ones, but those are going to be your most common. A scene heading is also kind of the most complicated one. It is the first one you'll almost always start typing, and it begins with either an INT for interior or an EXT for exterior. So you're letting the viewer know, or the reader know, this is an indoor scene or an outdoor scene. And that comes in handy later on when you're talking about scheduling your films. You'll want to try to shoot your interiors later in your shoot, because you can always use those as cover sets. And we'll talk about that when we talk about scheduling down the road. But just know you're pretty much always going to start with the interior or exterior, INT or EXT. Next, you put the location that the scene takes place. If you're outside, it's easy. Exterior, grandma's house. Okay, done. And then you would add the time of day as well. So either day or night. You can also use dawn or dusk or evening and morning. But generally speaking, unless that's important, just keep it to day or night. Just simplifies things. Now, if we're doing an interior, it can get a little more complicated. I would go interior, grandma's house, hyphen, so you put the little dash in there, and then I'm going to say which room of grandma's house I'm in. Am I in the kitchen? Am I in the living room? Or are we in the bathroom? Or are we in the bedroom? And then I do my time of day indicator after that. The reason why is that I can look at that and say, hey, this is a grandma's house location, and we are in the kitchen. If I just put interior kitchen day, whose kitchen are we in? Now, if the whole movie takes place at grandma's house, well, that's easy to figure out. But if I've got a couple different characters and we're in different locations and at their different houses, it is really nice to know, are we in Sue's kitchen or are we in Baxter's kitchen? So, yeah, interiors, you want to get a little more specific with your location part of the element for the scene heading. Now, when do you change scenes? This is a question a lot of new writers and filmmakers have. A scene change is any time the location or time of day changes. So if I've got a script and the characters are starting off outside, so that would be an exterior scene, and they walk through the front door, the moment they walk through the front door, I'm going to start a new scene and make that one an interior. It also would work, maybe we are inside the living room, and now I want to cut to a few hours later. That would also be a new scene change. I'm going to start a new scene heading for that. Even though we're in the same spot and nothing else has changed, the time of the day has changed. So I need to create a new scene for it. Where it starts to get kind of tricky, but also a little bit of fun, and I learned this doing my tribute to the Bourne films, is that if you've got two characters talking on a cell phone, then that becomes intercut back and forth. And there's a few ways you can handle that. You can actually, in your scene heading, specify, we're cutting back and forth between the two different scenes. But more commonly, what you'll see is a scene for every cut that needs to be in there. So maybe I'm outside in a park in one location, so exterior park day. And I've got my main character talking, and we've got a phone voice for the other character. When I'm ready to make the cut in my head, when I think it makes sense, I'm going to start a new scene. And now we're going to be at the other character's location. So maybe he's inside an office building. So now it's interior office day or continuous. And continuous is another form of the time of day stuff you can do. I don't like using it because if I'm scheduling my movie, I like knowing what the time of the day is. But backing up here, so I've got an exterior park, an interior office building, and the entire conversation will be intercut between those two scenes. So I'm going to do that on the page. When I want dialogue to be at one location, I'm going to change the scene to that location. When I want dialogue from the other location, I'm going to flip over to that one. And again, this is why I say if you read some scripts for movies that you're interested in that are in the genre you're trying to do, and suddenly this is all going to make a lot more sense to you. Action is going to be your next most common element in a script. Action is where you describe everything that you're seeing on screen. It's what the characters do, it's what the characters see. It is not what characters think, typically. Most writers don't try to get into the characters' heads, and that's the big difference between screenwriting and writing novels and other short stories. In those cases, it's perfectly okay to get into your character's head and talk about what they're thinking. But film is a visual medium. It's all about what you see on the screen. And so that's what you're going to do in your action bits. When you're writing action, it is important to be vivid, but not flowery. Use a lot of good adjectives. For those of you that don't know, adjectives means descriptors. Okay? Use your adjectives, but don't go overboard with them. You don't need to describe all the different hues and shades of the ocean and all the different ways the wind blows and the smell you get in the feel of the sand between your toes. It's too much, okay? Paint a good picture, but don't feel like you need to turn it into a Leonardo da Vinci painting necessarily either. Be okay with a Picasso. After action, we have characters. Characters are going to appear a couple different ways in the script. First, you will usually introduce them in the action element. So make sure that you are aware that you can type characters' names in the action. Jason Bourne crosses the room to go fight the bad guy. So I've described it in the action. I write his name. There's Bourne right there. The first time a character's name appears in the action beats of your script, when you're first introducing a character, you need to put that character's name in all capital letters. This tells the reader, hey, this is the first time we've seen this guy. And then it's also very common afterwards in parentheses or between two hyphens to give a really quick description. In that description, you're going to quickly put the character's age. So are they 20s, 30s, 40s, whatever? And then a really brief like description of them. Are they studious? Are they tall and slender? Are they squatty? Are they extremely overweight? Like if that stuff is important to your story, just a really quick blurb of it in there. And now you've told the reader this is kind of what this character is going to look like. Obviously, you're not always going to know because you cast the movie and you end up with something totally different than maybe what you originally intended to have. But at least you've got a general view for the reader of like, hey, this is what I'm picturing goes right here. Characters, as far as an element goes, they're always going to be capitalized. And that should happen by default with any of your screenplay programs. One of the neat features with some of these programs too, because it's all element based and stuff like that, is that if I want to change the character's name, there's usually a function in the software to change their name without having to do like a find and replace every single instance that that name occurs. And this is something I've actually had to do before, and it is super helpful to know that, hey, I can just go into my elements, change my character's name here, or find the function wherever it is in your software, and you're able to do it. I actually just did it the other day for a script I'm currently writing for my next feature, and I decided to change one of the main character's names. I don't know why, I just felt it didn't fit her anymore. But after I'd been writing for a little while and the personality changed, the name I had didn't fit. So I changed it to something else. And I found the change name option, and it changed it every element instance. So every time, during a dialogue scene, it also changed it everywhere else in the script too. So all of the action bits and stuff like that, and it matched the case. So if the first time it appeared when it was all in caps, it changed it that properly. All the rest of the times where it's just written with the first letter capitalized, it changed those, and so on. So really, really helpful to know. After characters, you've got dialogue. Dialogue is obviously what your characters are saying in a scene. And it's really important to make sure that you try to get your dialogue as natural as possible. There are some writers out there that are really good at writing dialogue. Quentin Tarantino writes great dialogue. Kevin Smith writes great dialogue. Christopher Temple, dialogue's a little bit of a weak point for me. But I have gotten a little bit better over the years. And one of the tricks I use is just to listen to how people talk. And I try to copy that in my script when I'm writing their dialogue. The other thing I try to do too is I try to make sure that every character has a very distinct personality. Okay, I talked about when I did Wolf, my first feature, how I had the stereotypes. I had the bitch, the slut, the blonde, the nerd, and the boyfriend. And by having those stereotypes and in my head, keeping track of which one was which, it made it a lot easier to try to get their personalities to come across in the way they spoke. Another trick you can do, and this one actually comes from Quentin Tarantino himself, and since I think he's got great dialogue, I'm willing to listen. One of his tricks he'll do to get good dialogue with his characters is to take two characters, sit them down in a room, and just get them talking to each other. And then eventually, if you can carry on the conversation, even you start to become surprised by what comes out of their mouths, and now they start developing that personality of their own. And I've used this trick so many times, it's not even funny. Even if I end up cutting out the first half of that scene where I just sat them down to get them talking, at least now I know what they sound like, and I can continue it forward from there. So a lot of times if I'm doing a quick scratch draft of a script where I'm only going to commit to about 30 pages just to kind of flesh things out, this is a technique I will use in that instance, and just have a talking scene. Just get them whatever, talking about the weather, talking about life, politics, religion, all the taboo topics, right? Get them talking about stuff, and then even I am surprised by what they say. So it's an amazing tip that seems to work for me, and kudos and shout out to Quentin Tarantino for that one. Now, with dialogue, another element we do need to be aware of is parentheticals. Some people use parentheticals like crazy, and a parenthetical is underneath a character's name in a dialogue sequence, and it's kind of showing some inflection. So are they cautious? Are they being weary? Are they being angry about something? And it's just two parentheses, and in the parentheses you type angrily, cautiously, with trepidation, or whatever. Some screenwriters like to direct the director by using those a lot, And directors hate when that happens because it's the director's job to interpret the script and to interpret that kind of a thing. But some screenwriters get a little high and mighty and they're like, well, this is the way it needs to be. And they'll do that. Now, if you, again, hopefully you're writing your own films that you're going to direct yourself. So in that case, that doesn't really matter. Do whatever you need to, but it is kind of a turnoff, I think, even for actors when you've got a lot of parentheticals. So I try to restrain myself personally to only using parentheticals when it's absolutely necessary and like, no, the scene has to go this way. It cannot go any other way because this is going to pay off later on in the film. So try to avoid those, but just know that they are available and it's part of your toolbox. And then the final element that you need to be aware of is your transitions. This is your fade in, fade out, cut to, that kind of a thing. And I only use them really if I'm trying to do a cross dissolve between two scenes, or I want to have a fade to black for dramatic effect. I'll throw that in there. And then, of course, at the end of the film, I'll either do cut to or fade to end credits. Now, some filmmakers, M. Night Shyamalan, he's one, he does cut to between every single scene. And it's really annoying and it jacks up your page count when you think about it. Because if you've got, let's say, 120 scenes in your script, that's 120 extra lines added of just cut to, cut to, cut to, cut to, cut to constantly. And it's going to throw things off. So use transitions when you need to, but don't use them all the time is really, I guess, what I'm trying to say here. All right, a couple more key points I want to talk about when it comes to screenwriting, and then we'll get ready to wrap this up. I apologize, this is turning into a longer podcast than usual, but there really is a lot to talk about here. First up, show don't tell. This is a huge, huge point. You'll hear filmmakers and screenwriters talk about this all the time. Show don't tell means remember that film is a visual medium. So try not to have your characters mansplain everything every step of the way. For instance, if somebody has planted a bomb under a table, don't have them explain to another character, I planted a bomb under that table. Instead, show the bomb under the table and then show the character's reaction that they knowingly put the bomb under the table. That's an example of show, don't tell. Too many screenwriters make their scripts too talky, too wordy by telling, not showing. So if you can take a scene even and here's a great example. This is the classic film school example. You got a couple characters and they're going to talk about what they want to do for the weekend. Oh yeah, hey, we should get some pizza. We should go to the video store, rent a movie. Maybe we'll play some video games. We'll have a great weekend. Or you can show the characters ordering a pizza, going to the video store, renting movies, getting their video games, coming back and having a good weekend together. See the difference? One is more interesting. People don't like to hear people talk about stuff, which is kind of ironic because you're listening to me talk during this podcast. But if you can, show, don't tell. Big pro tip. Let's talk about writer's block real quick. This is something that will probably happen to you no matter how planned out you are, no matter how many index cards you have and how many beats you figured out on your story. You're going to come to a point, and for me, it's usually about 3/4 of the way through the movie. I get 3/4 of the way through, and I freeze. I just don't know what to do with it anymore. It happens. It's normal. Here's how I deal with it. First thing I do is I try to change my location. If I've been sitting on the couch watching movies while I write, now I'll take my laptop and I'll go sit outside somewhere, weather permitting. I'll go, sit on the back porch or something like that. If I really needed to, maybe I'll even go to a coffee shop or something like that and set up over there and work on that for a couple of hours. So change your location. I also sometimes will change my software. If I've been using free or cheap software, this is the time, and actually this has always been the case, when I upgrade to a paid version of some sort of software. And for whatever reason, like I talked about earlier, paying for the software means you're more invested and are thus more motivated to find a way to make it work. And sometimes even just having that new interface is all it takes. You're like, oh, I've got a new car. I must take it for a test drive, right? It's the same kind of thing. Now, you can also change your interface in a lot of the softwares. I know Fade-In lets you go from dark to light or light to dark, depending what you want to do. Final Draft, same thing. They've got 3 different brightness modes you can switch between. So sometimes just making that little switch is all it takes, and everything is fresh and new, and suddenly you get more creative because of it. And then another thing I'll do is I'll just stop writing. I'll close the laptop and I go take a walk or take a hike, go fly fishing or something like that. Just something completely different from what I'm writing about. And then I can come back to it the next day with a fresh set of eyes and I'm more creative and ready to go again. All right, so you've heard me gab about writing these screenplays, and you might be asking yourself by now, well, how long is this going to take? And honestly, it really depends on you, the writer. I've heard of some writers that can knock out an entire feature in a weekend. I'm not one of those. It takes me months and months to write a first draft of a script. I think my quickest first draft was 1 month, but on average, it takes me 3 to 6 months. And my longest has been, I think, 8 to 10 months to write a first draft. So it can take a while. Don't rush it. Take your time and have some fun with it too, especially with the first draft. Don't be too precious about your writing. This is another pro tip. Just get it on the page, barf it out. Okay, sometimes we call it a vomit draft for that reason. You're just trying to go bleh all over your screen and just get it all out there. It's your revisions when you can start to become more precious about stuff and trying to be more particular about things. So just get it out there first. It's the best advice I can give you. Speaking of revisions, everybody has their own process for doing this. Couple things. One, don't lock your script until you've started the scheduling process. Okay, I know it's tempting to want to have all the cool colored pages and all the asterisks that appear up and down your page, but don't worry about that until after you started scheduling. Then that's when you lock your drafts. Until then, just go back and either rewrite the script from scratch using your previous draft as a guide, or what I do, I'll print out my script and I go through with a red pen and a highlighter. I use my red pen to make all the changes I want to do, and then I take the highlighter and I put a big slash across the page. And what that means is that as I'm flipping through my script page by page, I see the big slash. Now I look for the red pen. There's the change I need to make, and I go back to my final draft document and I make the changes. I like having the physical paper when I do my revisioning. It's just the way my brain works. If you're better reading off your screen, then by all means do that. Again, there's no right or wrong way. I'm just trying to share what works for me. All right, 3 more points here I want to talk about. A common, not criticism, but response I'll get from independent filmmakers that want to do their first feature is, I just don't have time. I don't have time to write the script. Okay? I believe there's 2 kinds of people in the world. You got doers and you got talkers. Doers get things done. A talker talks about what they're going to do. Oh, I'm going to write a movie about this. I'm going to write a movie about this. But they never actually even start. Even if it's a movie that you know you can't do right now because of budget constraints or whatever, sometimes it's a good exercise just to write that script anyway, and then you keep it tucked away in your computer for the time when you are able to approach that. I've had that happen many times. The script I'm working on right now, I started probably 13, 14 years ago originally. I wrote the first draft way back then. I've now revisited it, and I'm starting the whole thing over from scratch, but that's okay. I wrote the script I wanted to write at the time, and now I actually get to look at, making it a reality. So again, coming back to that common complaint of like, I just don't have the time. I'm going to sound like Morpheus for a minute, because time is like the Matrix. It's all around us. You just have to look for it. Whether that means you wake up 30 minutes early each morning while your spouse is still asleep. Put your computer on really dim, you start typing that way. If you're single, it's even easier. You don't have a spouse you have to worry about waking up, right? Lunch breaks at work. This is the best one. If you're fortunate enough to have a job where you get an hour lunch break, cut that in half. You're going to spend half an hour eating, and then you spend the other half hour writing. Okay, if you're only having to write on your phone because you don't want to carry your laptop with you, then do that. You can write on your phone. There's ways you can do that. And that would be a whole nother discussion for another time, but just know that it is possible to do. Lunch breaks are huge. If you're working 5 days a week, you've just gained 2.5 hours of writing every single week when you do that. The other thing you can do is, especially if you're single, pick a day of the week on the weekend when you're not working, like a Sunday, and say, I'm going to commit 6 hours to writing today. Boom, 6 hours of writing time. You'd be surprised what you can do in 6 hours. You can crank out a fair amount of pages when you do that. Let's talk about copyright real quick. People always get all uppity about copyright kind of stuff. They don't want people to steal their ideas. All right. In the old days, and if you read a lot of older film books, they talk about mailing yourself a copy of the script and having the postmaster stamp it on like the corners of the envelope and across the where the flap is and stuff like that. That doesn't really hold up in a court. Like, don't do that. It's a waste of time and money. Instead, just email a PDF to yourself. And this also makes for a good backup too. I've actually had computer hard drives crash, and I've recovered my scripts because I've emailed them to myself. We all have multiple email addresses these days. So pick one and send it to your other one. That's all you got to do. Now it's also timestamped by the internet. You could literally take this and say, at this date and time, I emailed this to myself, therefore the script was already completed at that date and time. So it does stand up a little bit better if you ever had to take it to court. You can also watermark your PDF files on export, okay, from your screenwriting program. Learn how to do that. That's an option you can do. If you're sending it to somebody to proofread, put their name in the watermark. If it ever leaks online, you're going to know who did it, right? So that's an option. One thing I would say is if you're going to have somebody else read your script, get them to sign what's called an NDA, or a non-disclosure agreement. This just means that they can't tell anybody about what they've read from your script. So again, it's part of that confidential side of things. If you're just starting out and just launching your career, don't worry about this kind of stuff. And don't, by like any stretch of the imagination, the one thing you absolutely never want to do is send your script to a producer or to a studio unsolicited. If they didn't ask for it from you, don't send it to them. It will not work. It's going to end up in a pile. And I've actually heard of instances where, like on a TV show, somebody sent it in to them unsolicited, and then 2 years later, they're watching a show, and it was their pilot script to a T. They didn't even bother to change character names or the events or anything. They completely ripped it off. The guy tried to take the studio to court, and the studio said, "Oh, I didn't know you were wanting us to buy it from you. We thought you were just giving us a good idea." Guess who won? The studio won on that case. So don't do that. Just don't even consider that kind of a thing. All right, in closing, I know this has been a bit of a doozy here, but in closing, you will probably need a laptop and some sort of software if you don't want to hate your life. Okay, if you're going to write a script, get a laptop, get some software. There's plenty of software out there, Windows, Mac, and Linux. You've heard my opinions on them. Just go for it. Tab and Enter are going to be your friends. Generally speaking, 1 page equals 1 minute. Don't freak out about copyright. And finally, you can make time to write your script. If you've got time for video games or watching movies or hanging out with friends, you have time to write. It's like Nike says, just do it. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. My name is Christopher Tempel, and you've been listening to Indie Rebel, the podcast for independent filmmakers.